كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, page 289 of volume 5 of this particular Bakdash edition. So, al-ushru wal-kharaju. Imam Maydani says, وَلَمَّا أَنْهَى الْكَلَامَ عَلَى بَيَانِ مَا يَصِيرُ الْحَرْبِيُّ بِهِ ذِمِّيًّا أَخَذَ فِي بَيَانِ مَا يُؤْخَذُ مِنْهُ وَبَيَانِ الْعُشْرِ تَتْمِيمًا لِلْوَظَائِفِ الْمَالِيَّةِ. When the author completed his discussion on an exposition of how a harbi becomes a dhimmi, he then started discussing what kind of taxes could be imposed on them, and also a clarification regarding the ushr and the taif system which applies to Muslims. This is to be able to complete the discussion on all the financial obligations. So let's start off with ardul ushr. That's what he starts off with first. I already explained in the introduction the difference between ushr and kharaj, right? So one other aspect of it that we need to understand is that ushr is usually is applied to Muslims, and it's going to be applied to those lands that were received and distributed among the Muslims, for those who are combatants and they got their spoils of war. So out of the spoils of war, if they were given pieces of land, they have to pay ushr on it. If the non-Muslims have been kept on their land, that's when it's going to become kharaj. This will be discussed by Imam Quduri and Imam Maydani in more detail, but I thought I'd just mention that as an additional point of difference of how does the land become ushri or kharaji. Kharaji, as we already explained, it's when a land is taken over by force, and if the Muslim leader allows the existing inhabitants to carry on dealing with that land, then they have to pay the kharaj tax. The ushr is usually going to be imposed on the produce of land that was also taken over by Muslims, but that were taken over by Muslims, and the inhabitants of that particular land, the people who owned that land, they became Muslim, right? They became Muslim optionally from beforehand, or it was similar to the kharaj aspect where it was taken by force, but then it was distributed among Muslims. So now Muslims are given it in ownership, so that would then make that ushr land as well. So kharaj land is only when it's originally administrated by non-Muslims by leave of the Muslim, by leave of the Muslim leader to have maintained them on that land. That land, the kharaji land, will remain kharaji afterwards, even if a Muslim buys it afterwards as well. We'll discuss all of this. So then he says that he has started discussing the ushr first, because ushr is not just a financial obligation. It's also because it's Muslim, there's a level of obligation, there's a level of worship that's incorporated, an element of worship that's incorporated in there, while kharaj is more of an element of punishment, along with the financial obligation aspect of it. So, وَأَرْضُ الْعَرَبِ كُلُّهَا أَرْضُ عُشْرٍ. All of the lands of the Arab is considered to be the land of ushr, the tithe, the tenth. Because the tithe comes from the word tithe. The reason I'm using it, because in Arabic it's ushr. Ushr means 1/10. And the tithe is an Old English term that is that comes from Tia Gotha. I think I'm pronouncing that right. To tithe is to make a contribution. So tithe your land, or tithe your income, or to tithe. It's used, both used as a noun and a verb. So to tithe means to contribute equal to 1/10 of your income or your produce or whatever it is. So it's a levy of 1/10. That's ushr, is a levy of 1/10. Kharaj has different rates, and you'll see that later. But ushr in its name means to tithe 1/10, essentially. To tithe it, which means to give 1/10. So he says, Quduri says, all the Arab lands are considered to be the land of the tithe, or tithe land. لأن الخراج لا يجب ابتداء إلا بعقد الذمة. Because there's no way to establish the kharaj land tax, the land tax called kharaj. I'm just going to use the word kharaj, it's just easier than to try to translate it. Kharaj usually comes from the concept of produce, of something which comes out of something anyway. So I'm just going to use the word kharaj, right? So kharaj essentially cannot be imposed and become obligatory from the outset except by a contract of dhimma. So it can only start off, a land can only become a kharaj land if the people on there become dhimmis essentially. It goes hand in hand with people of dhimma, in terms of how the land is first established as a kharaj land. Of course, if it's bought by a Muslim afterwards, they're not going to be dhimmi, so it doesn't have to remain like that. But at the outset, for it to become established as a kharaj land, it has to be to do with the dhimma, right? Which means the non-Muslim citizens of a Muslim land that have been allowed to continue with that land. Now, this can't take place, as we've read before in one of the previous sessions, that this can't be something that can be imposed on a mushrik or a polytheist of the Arabs, because they don't have the choice of becoming a dhimma, and this is subordinate to the dhimma system. So for them, there's no such thing. They'll have a different consequence. وَهِيَ أَيْ أَرْضُ الْعَرَبِ أَيْ حَدُّهَا. Now, he's going to discuss in classical times, traditional times, in the beginning times when this was first established. I don't know how much this still applies in those areas, because I haven't visited those areas to check. But traditionally speaking, those lands that were designated as tithe lands or ushur or kharaj, right, during the time of the Sahaba, this is what we're going to discuss first. So these are the historical lands that were treated like that and deemed as such, to give us an idea, right? Whether they still deal with them like that right now, and most of this is in Iraq and other places, I'm not sure because I haven't been there. But this is how we discuss this, just to understand that this is how it was for a very long time, at least until Maidani was discussing it. Maidani was recent, in the last 200 years, right? Just around 200 years ago. So if he's discussing it, then it may have been still applied at that time, and then after that with all nation states and that, things might have, and the dismantling of the Khilafah system, things might be different today. I'll need to check that out. وَهِيَ أَيْ أَرْضُ الْعَرَبِ أَيْ حَدُّهَا. So the ushur lands are the Arab lands, and the Arab lands, he's going to tell us what those Arab lands are. أي حدها ما بين العذيب, right? قرية من قرى الكوفة إلى أقصى أي آخر حجر بفتحتين واحد الأحجار بمعنى صخرة كما وقع في التحديد به في غير موضع باليمن بمهرة. اسم موضع باليمن يسمى باسم مهرة بن حيدان أبي قبيلة تنسب إليه الإبل المهرية، فيكون قوله بمهرة بدلا من قوله باليمن كما في البناية إلى حد الشام. Okay, what does that mean? He's saying that the boundaries of this land of Arabs, which is traditionally the Ushri land, it is from one side, it's from Udhayb. Now Udhayb is one of the outlying villages of the Kufa region in Iraq. It extends from there in the east, right? So Kufa is in the east. If we say the Hijaz, Makkah, Mukarram, Medina, Munawwara, from the Iraq, beyond Najd and all of that, that is in the east. So that's where it starts from, the place called Udhayb near Kufa in Iraq, and it extends all the way into the Arabian Peninsula, down in Yemen, to a place, to what they call the furthest rock. So there's probably rocks there, I don't know if that still exists. It's called Aqsa al-Hajar or Aqsa Hajar. Aqsa Hajarin bil-Yaman bimahra. So it's the furthest rock, right? Furthest rock, some boulders of some sort, in Yemen, in a place called Mahra. This particular place called Mahra is known as Mahra of Ibn Haydan, which is the Qabila or the tribe to which the Mahriya camels also are attributed. So apparently there were good camels from there called the Mahriya camels. Now, I don't know if they were good, but there were camels called Mahriya camels. This essentially is a place in Yemen, so they could say Yemen or Mahra, right? And that is there. And then after that, from north, so that's essentially from east to kind of south, and then to the north, so it's almost like forming a triangle in a sense, and it probably is to the extent of the Hijaz, which is the western border of Arabia, but they haven't mentioned that for some reason. So they tell us the eastern boundary, tell us the southern boundary, and then he said ila haddi Sham, to the boundaries of Sham up north, right? So there are some other descriptions of this as well. We'll just look into that. In the Maghrib, it relates. Maghrib is a kind of a fiqhi dictionary, right? So there's a quote related there from Imam Abu Yusuf, which I'll let you know, and then there's a few other quotes as well. Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers and sisters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala benefit us through this course. We're on lesson number 13, and we move on to the next section in this overall discussion of the expeditions and international relations and so on. This is actually about what they call al-ushr wal-kharaj. Al-ushr wal-kharaj. So this next lesson and this lesson and the next lesson will take to cover this topic, inshallah. So al-ushr and kharaj, what we're going to be, I'll just introduce it to you first. Ushr and kharaj are two distinctive forms of taxation in the Islamic fiscal system, right? So ushr is a religious tithe, right? A tithe is essentially the tenth of something. So it's a religious tithe that's imposed on Muslims, typically a rate of 10% on agricultural produce from naturally irrigated land, example rain-fed or river-fed. So we're going to look at all of that in detail anyway, but I'm just giving you the overall. And at other times it's only 5% on land irrigated by artificial means. So if you have to do something to irrigate the land, for example, use a well or some other artificial means, then it is only 5%. And it's considered an act of worship and applies to land owned by Muslims usually only, right? So it's actually a worship. There's an aspect of worship in there. Then number two, the other type of the kharaj essentially is the land tax originally imposed on non-Muslim lands. If a Muslim buys it afterwards, it's still going to be kharaj tax, right? And usually that's on any land that was conquered by force and compulsion by the Muslims. So over time though, it becomes extended to any other cultivators of that same land, regardless of religion, in those conquered territories. So this will only apply to conquered territories, not to any other territory. And kharaj then, kharaj is tied to the land itself and based on the potential or estimated yield, and not the actual cultivation. Whereas the ushr was actually, the tithe is actually 10% of whatever actually comes out, right? Whatever actually is produced and cultivated, not on just the potential. Whereas in kharaj, in most cases, even if it end up not producing something, except for very particular reasons, there's still a tax imposed on that. The other thing that we'll learn by the end is that the two taxes cannot coexist on the same land. So you can't have the same land and charge it, one for the tithe, the tenth, and also for kharaj, right? Because ushr only applies to voluntarily submitted Muslim lands, while kharaj applies to the conquered lands. Of course, both of them, the benefit of them is that they both serve as key revenue sources in the Islamic government, while ushr does reflect a religious obligation. The kharaj reflects more of almost a form of punishment, you could say, a form of punishment on the administrators of it, right? So having said that, inshallah, that's what we're going to be looking at, the various different aspects of that, inshallah, in today's lesson. So in the Maghrib, which is a dictionary, An Abi Yusuf, he quotes from Imam Abu Yusuf from his book called the Amali, which are his dictations. Hudud Ardil Arab, the boundaries of the land of the Arab, is between the boundaries of the land of Kufa. So he doesn't refer to the particular village, he just talks about Kufa overall in general, in the east, all the way down to the furthest rock in Yemen, and which is the area of Mahra, he says. Imam Qarhi then says, so he adds here that he starts off with actually the Hijaz. The others expect you to just understand that it's from east to the south to the north. So this western border. So it's essentially like a triangle almost, right? It's like a triangle. Whereas the eastern border of Arabia, where Makkah, Mukarramah, Medina, and all of that, that's all included. But Imam Karhi, who's a scholar of Egypt, scholar of Baghdad, right? He says that it's the land of Hijaz and the Tihama and Yemen. So he goes down south and he includes Makkah and Ta'if. So Ta'if is going east. And then he says, and then the rest of the wilderness. So he refers to the wilderness, the Bariya, Yani al-Badi, and the rest of the desert. So all of that desert area he includes as well into it. So different people have said different things, but they all mean the same thing. Imam Muhammad rahimahullah says Ardul Arab, the land of the Arab, is from Udhayb to Makkah. So he's actually going east to west literally, because Makkah is in the center, right, of the western border. So Udhayb in Iraq to Makkah, and then he says Adanu Abiyan ila Aqsa Hajr bil Yemen bi Mahra. So he's talking about the Aden area, that is the Aden of Abiyan, right? Until the furthest stone or boulders of Yemen in Mahara. And this was quoted from the Maghrib, because the Maghrib is a dictionary that brings all of these different definitions from the jurists of the Hanafi school. And so this was quoted in a concise fashion from there. Now Imam Maydani says that all of these definitions, they're very close. They're all talking about the same thing, and they're just explaining what maybe the other one has missed out. This Aden is interesting because in one of them they didn't actually mention a northern boundary. They just talked about Aden, and Aden is in the south anyway. It's actually more south than Makkah Mukarramah. But for some reason he said Aden is actually it's a place in Yemen. It's the Aden, as they say today, right? And the reason it's called Adenu Abiyan is because Abiyan was its founder. So that's why it's called Aden, the Aden of Abiyan, right? As mentioned in the Misbah. So that's essentially, traditionally speaking, that was considered to be, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and or later, at least during the time of the Sahaba, the Khulafa, because a lot of that was conquered afterwards and taken over afterwards. That became, for many centuries, that was considered the Ardul Arab, the Arab lands, because the natives in those areas, the residents, were all Arabs in that area. Beyond that, then people didn't speak Arabic. Then it touched the Persian lands, it touched the Turkic lands, it touched the Roman lands, and of course down south, beyond into Africa, it would have been various different languages down there. So that's why this was called Ardul Arab, and because it was Ardul Arab, it was also the Ushri lands, because the Muslims eventually had all of these lands. Now let's move on to Ardul Kharaj. Okay. Now again, as I said, this is what it was classically referred to. Now once you go to the Kufan region of the Udhayb that we discussed, then beyond that would start the Kharaj lands. So he's saying was Sawadu, ay Ardu Sawad al-Iraq. Now in a lot of our classical texts, they refer to the Sawad of Iraq. Sawad usually means the black area, but here what it refers to is actually something which is darkened by its fertility. So it's the fertile lands of Iraq. It's like huge area of fertile lands of Iraq, right? Wonderful water sourced. So that's why they refer to it as the Sawad of Iraq. It's the fertile lands of Iraq beyond the cities, right? Which seems like it encompassed quite a bit of it. Ay Ardu Sawad al-Iraq. This is the land of, this is referring to the land of the fertile lands of Iraq. It's called Sawadan. The reason it's called Sawad, which comes from the concept of Sud, which means black, لِخُضْرَةِ أَشْجَارِهِ وَزُرُوعِهِ, because of the extreme lushness and greenness of its trees and its crops and cultivation. وَهُوَ الَّذِي فُتِحَ عَلَى عَهْدِ سَيِّدِنَا عُمَرَ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ. These lands were conquered and opened during the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, our leader. فَأَقَرَّ أَهْلَهُ عَلَيْهِ. And they became Kharaj lands because these lands were not distributed among the Muslim combatants, right? But rather the people of the area were allowed to remain there and just pay a tax. That's why they became Kharaj lands. So they give us a tax based on it. Okay? So that's essentially what he's saying. وَوَضَعَ So وَهُوَ الَّذِي فُتِحَ. Yes. فأقر أهله عليه, he kept the people on it. ووضع على رقابهم الجزية, and he just imposed a jizya, of course, on them as being Muslim non-Muslim inhabitants. وعلى أراضهم الخراج, so along with imposing jizya on them, based on the capacity and the capability of the land, he gave them kharaj on that. He imposed a kharaj tax on there. Ardu kharajin, so he says wasawadu ardu kharajin. Imam Quduri says, right, that this sawad, fertile land area, which we've just given you the history for, those are called the lands of kharaj. لأنه وظيفة أرض الكفار, because that is the obligation of the lands of the disbelievers, right, that come under Muslim rule. It's just the tax that they pay. Muslims pay tax as well. There's just slight difference in there, which you'll see. وهي أي أرض السواد حدها. Now what is those traditionally speaking, that Ardul Kharaj, what is that land? What's the boundaries of it? So he says that the boundary of that in terms of its width is ما بين العذيب المتقدمة إلى عقبة حلوان. So remember, we had gotten to Udhayb in the east, which is near Kufa. So now beyond Udhayb, now it starts from there. The Kharaj land starts from there traditionally, and it goes all the way to Aqabatu Hulwan, place called Aqabatu Hulwan. And it's a very famous, it's a well-known city in the area, and it's not that far off from Baghdad. In fact, it's about 5 stages in distance from Baghdad, right? 5 stages. Now, Baghdad did not exist during the time of the 4 Khulafa. Baghdad was only founded later on, after the Umayyads were even deposed in 132 Hijri, right? After that, it was during the Abbasid times, the second leader of the Abbasids, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. It was established during that time. So Baghdad did not exist, but just because Baghdad became the reference point afterwards, he's saying it's a 5-stage journey, right, from Baghdad. وَهِيَ طَرْفُ الْعِرَاقِ مِنَ الْمَشْرِقِ, and that is, you can say, the boundary of Iraq in the east. After that is Persia, right? After that is Persia, which is, you can say, the Persian speaking lands. سميت باسم بانيها, and that area is called Aqabat Hulwan, وهو حلوان ibn Imran ibn al-Harith. So the place is Aqaba. It's a Aqaba. Aqaba usually refers to a ravine, right, or a mountain pass. But here it's called Aqabatu Hulwan because the person who established that, who founded that, was called Hulwan, son of Imran ibn al-Harith. Okay, so that's its eastern edge, going beyond. Now, وحدها طولا, but in terms of its length, right, من العلث, alth, ayn lam tha, right, kind of a strange word to say in English, right? This is a qarya ala sharqi Dijla. It's on the eastern bank, or eastern, near the eastern bank of the Tigris River, which is in Iraq, right? And it says qaryatun muqafatun ala al-alawiyya. Wallahu alam, that might mean that this was an area that was originally endowed as an endowment, right, for the Alawis of that area, right? Wallahu alam. Ila Abbadan, so it starts in the north from Alath, right, or rather it starts in length from Alath, and it goes to Abbadan. Abbadan was a small fortress, right? A small fortress that was on the that was on the bank of the ocean, of the river, right? Sorry, of the sea. So there's other descriptions as well, which I'll just quickly go through. I don't know how important this is for us, but just to understand the history of it at some point, because what happens is, if you don't understand this, if you haven't the point of reference to this, then when a discussion comes in usul al-fiqh or fiqh itself regarding different things, then you just never know what this is referring to. What are these lands? What is Sawadul Iraq? It comes multiply to talk about Sawadul Iraq because it remained the Sawad for so long. So that's why we need to understand it. So now from Maghrib, again going back to the Hanafi dictionary, it says حده طولا من حديثة الموصل ومن حديثة الموصل إلى عبادان. He starts it off from a place called Haditha. A big battle took place as well during the time of the Khulafa. So that's a place called Haditha near Mosul, the place of Hadithatul Mosul to Abadan. And in width, it's referring to Udhayb to Hulwan. So he agrees in Udhayb to Hulwan, but he has a slightly different term when he talks about its length. Likewise then, when since it's a dictionary, under the entry under Ha, he says Hadithatul Mosul. He then describes what this place is. Hadithatul Mosul is a village, وهي, and it is also the first boundary of the Sawad in the north. And Hadithatul Furat is another place. So don't mix this up. Hadithatul Mosul is different from Hadithatul Furat, which means that there's two places called Haditha. So he's just telling us. Similarly, for example, there are two places called Tripoli or Tarabulus in Arabic. One is Tripoli, that was supposed to be the capital of Libya, and the other one is the Tarabulus of you can say the west, which is Tripoli, the famous city in Lebanon. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve these places. So that's the discussion there. Likewise, you have two Hyderabad's, right? One Hyderabad in Pakistan, and then you have Hyderabad Deccan, which refers to the southern Hyderabad. Deccan means southern. Likewise, you have London, Ontario, and London, UK, and you have York and New York. And this is, multiple names. Sometimes multiple places are named after the same thing, maybe due to some resemblance or some other reason. So that was that. Then under Tha, when he talks about Tha'labiyya, he says, under the Tha entry, he says, Tha'labiyya min manazil al-badiyah. These are the desert stations. وَوَضْعُهَا مَوْضِيَ الْعَلْثِ فِي حَدِّ السَّوَادِ خَطَأٌ. And placing it in the location of Alath as being a boundary of the Sawad, that's wrong. So don't refer to that as the Sawad. That's a different place. That the Tha'labiyya is not the place that is Alath that we're talking about, right? So anyway, there's those different discussions as we're having. Then eventually he says that Alath and Hadithatul Mosul, because remember there were two boundaries that were referred to. One is called Hadithatul Mosul, the other one is called Alath, right? Those both have been spoken about as being boundaries of the Sawad because they're literally aligned in terms of in the same kind of probably latitude, I would say. So that's why you can treat either one and both of them will give you the boundary because they're both aligned, right? However, if anybody tells you to define the boundary of Tha'labiyya, then that's wrong. I know this might be a bit boring for you, but Imam Maydani had mentioned this, that's why I mentioned it to you. But ignore that part if you wish. Now, he's going into now the ahkam and the rulings regarding these places. So he says, وَأَرْضُ السَّوَادِ مَمْلُوكَةٌ لِأَهْلِهَا. These places, all of these lands of the Sawad of Iraq, the fertile lands of Iraq, all of these are owned by their residents. They're the people who own it, right? And these are the non-Muslims usually. However, it's permissible for them, and this was in those days. Of course, after that, they've been probably sold to Muslims. And again, I don't know what the situation is now after all of that. So يَجُوزُ بَيْعُهُمْ لَهَا, and it was completely fine for the non-Muslims to sell them off, وَتَصَرُّفٌ فِيهَا, or to administrate them in any way they wished. So they were allowed to do what they wanted in there. لأن الإمام إذا فتح أرضا عنوة وقهرا, because when the Imam conquers a land out of force, by force or compulsion, then he has a choice. كان بالخيار بين أن يقسمها بين الغانمين. Either he can distribute those lands between among the Muslim conquerors, right? وبين أن يمتن بها على أهلها, or he can leave them to their original residence. ويضع عليهم الجزية والخراج, and then just impose the jizya tax, for themselves, and the kharaj on them. جباية المسلمين, and what's the benefit of that? Well, the Muslims get an income from that. So this becomes a collection and an income for the Muslims, as has passed before. Now he gives the ruling of the kharaj, and he says وكل أرض أسلم أهلها عليها قبل أن يقدر عليها. Any land in the non-Muslim areas, right, where their inhabitants, their owners became Muslim before the Muslims conquered and took it by force. So they might have seen the Muslim coming, they just became Muslim, right, genuinely, or for whatever reason they became Muslim, right? أو فتحت عنوة, or they were initially conquered out of force and the residents did not become Muslim. وقسمت بين الغانمين, but then those same lands that could have been Kharaj lands, but they were distributed among the Muslimin, among the Muslim, the Muslim warriors, right, who won the battle there, they become land of Ushr now. So if it was given to the non-Muslims, it becomes Kharaji. If it's given to the Muslims, then these are also Ushri lands, just like the lands of the Arabs earlier were Ushri lands as well. لأنها وظيفة أرض المسلمين. You can't impose Kharaj on an original Muslim land, okay, that was given to Muslims, right? Because the designation starts there. Give it to non-Muslims or Muslims, the designation, that's where it begins. If you give it to Muslim, it becomes a Ushri land, because that is the obligation of that, right? Because they get to get reward for paying that as well, because there's an element of worship in there as well. وَكُلُّ أَرْضٍ فُتِحَتْ عَنْوَةً وَأُقِرَّ أَهْلُهَا عَلَيْهَا. And then he clarifies, he says that any land that was taken by force and then their own inhabitants, without having to become Muslim, were left to administrate it. And likewise, if the Imam didn't necessarily take the area by force, but took it through a treaty with them, some kind of agreement with them, and took over the lands, then all of those lands will become Kharaj lands, as we've told you before, because that is usually going to be the obligation on any land owned by non-Muslims from the onset, right? Because there is an aspect of punishment involved in that. قال في الهداية. So now the question is that Makkah was also taken by force, so why does Makkah remain Ushri land or Kharaji land, or what is it? So he's saying that Makkah is an exception to all of this. Makkah has been made an exception, particularized from all of this. Did take it by force. وَتَرَكَ لِأَهْلِهَا, and he did leave it to the non-Muslims of Makkah. He did not confiscate the lands. He didn't give it to, he left it to the Muslim non-Muslim inhabitants. So those should be originally Kharaji lands. However, the Prophet ﷺ there made an exception, and he did not obligate or stipulate or impose the Kharaj on them. So they are not Kharaji lands. Okay, that's an exception though. That's an exception. Now there's lands that were not cultivated. So we're talking so far about those lands that are cultivated. Then there's going to be, within all of those areas, there's going to be land that is not cultivated. It's kind of barren land. Nobody's doing anything with it. There's lots of land that's owned by the state or whatever. Nobody's doing anything. There's no person who's laying claim to that land. Large tracts of land. What do you do with those? Right? Within these Ushri lands and these Kharaji lands, you've got all these empty lands. What do you do with them? Barren lands. So then he says, وَمَنْ أَحْيَا مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ أَرْضًا مَوَاتًا أي غير منتفع بها فهي عند أبي يوسف معتبرة بحيزها أي بما يقرب منها فإن كانت من حيز أرض الخراج فهي خراجية وإن كان من حيز أرض العشر فهي عشرية لأن ما قارب شيء يعطى حكمه كفناء الدار له حكم الدار حتى يجوز لصاحبها الانتفاع به. So then he says, anybody who revives and does something and cultivates, etc., revives a land, any Muslim who does that, right, of any barren land that has not been, that doesn't have any utility so far, then according to Imam Abu Yusuf, that will be given the ruling and considered according to whatever is in its proximity, right? So if it's in the proximity of other lands which are Kharaji lands, then that will also be seen as Kharaji land, even though it's Muslims who have enlivened it, because it's too close to Kharaji lands, and that's its onset. Now if on the other hand, if it's actually close enough in the proximity of Ushri lands, the tithe lands, then it becomes tithe lands, right? Because anything close to something is usually given its same ruling, because that's the easy way to do it, right? Just like in the case of a house and its courtyard, the courtyard is treated as in the house in terms of certain masail. For example, if somebody said, I'm not going to enter this area or whatever. Now then he talks about Basra, and Basra, according to Imam Yusuf, that's another case. Basra is within Iraq, right? Basra though is a Ushri land because all of the Sahaba made a consensus on that, had a consensus on that. However, it should have actually been Kharaji land because it's actually very close to the fertile lands of Iraq, which are Kharaji lands, Remember, Iraq, Basra. Except the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they imposed on there, because maybe it's just all Muslims living there, and imposed the ushur on there. So that's why the qiyas was left over, because of the agreement. Even if the people there may have been non-Muslim at the time, they imposed the ushur there and not the kharaj. And Imam Muhammad, he says, تُعْتَبَرْ بِالشِّرْبِهَا. So we will conclude with that, inshallah. Conclude for today. We essentially covered the distinction between an ushri land and a kharaji land. The ushri land essentially was what was given to Muslims after a land is taken over somehow, right? And a Muslim is then given it either because he was a warrior in the army or whatever the case is. So that becomes a ushri. That means it's a tithe land, which means 1/10 has to be paid. And if it's a land that was given to the Ahlul Dhimma, they were made non-Muslim residents of the Muslim lands, and they were left on their lands, then that becomes kharaji land. If that same land was given to a Muslim, it would become ushri land. So that's essentially what he said, and then he gave the boundaries of it, which is from the Hijaz in the west to Udayb in Iraq to the east, and then down south to the furthest stone in a place called Mahra in Yemen, to up north to Sham, which is the Levant, Syria. So that's the case. And then after that, from Udayb in the east, going further east to Hulwan and to Abadan in the south, and Alath in the north, that became the Kharaj lands, which were the fertile lands of Iraq. Now again, this is a classical classification, you could say, from that time. Things probably changed since then, and most of the Kharaji lands probably came under Muslim rule afterwards anyway. And the discussion there was that the people who are given the Kharaji lands from the outset, they're allowed to sell, they're allowed to transfer it. There'll be more discussion about that later anyway. And then there was a discussion regarding those people who take barren land and they revive it. So what kind of tax is going to impose them there? It's going to be whatever's closest to it. So the Kharaji land is close to it, it'll be Kharaj, otherwise it's going to be Ushur. There's two exceptions to this. One was Makkah, that though the non-Muslim residents there after its conquest were left to it, but the Prophet did not impose a tax on there of the Kharaj. And Basra, that which was made a ushri land by the ijma of the Sahaba, because remember they all settled, many of them settled in Basra. So that was the discussion there, and we'll just finish off Imam Muhammad's view though. This was Imam Yusuf's view, the final part. Imam Muhammad says, تُعْتَبَرُ بِشِرْبِهَا. The way to determine any barren land, right, as to what it's going to become, it depends on its irrigation source, right? What is its irrigation source? إِذْ هُوَ سَبَبٌ لِلنُّمَاء, because that is the cause of its productivity. If you don't have irrigation, how are you going to have productivity in that land? So in ahyaha bima'is sama, if the person revived it just using the rain, just figured out, just kind of somehow channeled the rain in that direction, or through the earth, through a well that he dug there, right, or through some kind of irrigationary canal, right, a stream or something that he managed to divert from some other place, or he took it from the water of the Euphrates, right? Remember, this is talking about Iraq, right? He took it from the Euphrates, or he took it from the Tigris River, the two major rivers of Iraq, right? Or from any other major lakes that nobody owns, like Sayhun or Jayhun, which is the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, right? Which are located there in Khurasan. Then that land becomes the Ushri land. It's the tithe land. 1/10 has to be given of that, right? Because لأنها مياه العشري, right? Because all of these are the waters of the Ushri lands anyway. However, if he was to enliven these, revive these through lakes that he was to have really made a lot of effort to bring there and to dig up large tracts to make a lake. Actually, no. He says that if they were, because you see all the other lands, they come in Ushri lands. All the other lakes and stuff, they come in Ushri lands. Whereas if he was to have irrigated this through the lands, or rather the lakes that were originally constructed by the non-Arabs, right? and inshallah we'll discuss these in the next lesson. Then he says that they're going to have a different hukum, so we'll just wait for that for the next lesson inshallah. We'll see you then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.